Welcome everyone. The webinar will begin shortly and will be recorded. Connect with the campaign on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. Use hashtags GLR Reading and hashtags Learning Tuesdays to share any questions, reflections, or observations that you learned from today's webinar. Once again, the webinar will begin shortly. Okay, once again, we would love to connect with you on social media. So on Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. This webinar will be recorded and shared with you afterwards. Okay, welcome. My name is Sierra Sanchez, the producer with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Before we begin, I would just like to share a few housekeeping tips for everyone. First, we would love to hear about you, so please introduce yourself in the chat box. Be sure to select panelists and attendees when you are sharing, so that way we all know who is here. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but we encourage your engagement by using the chat box at the bottom of the screen. And we would also love for you to post any questions that you might have in the Q&A box. We will dedicate the last 20 to 30 minutes to respond to the questions you post during the discussion. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be emailed to all who registered. And we will be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during Q&A and highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement at the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Lastly, before we start, I would just like to call your attention to our upcoming GLR Learning Tuesdays webinars. Next week on January 19th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, we have COVID-19 and learning loss, what the data tells us, why we must act with urgency. On Tuesday, January 26th, we have two back-to-back webinars. First, Strategies for Sustainability with Turn the Page KC, and COVID-19 and Learning Loss 2, what the data tells us about moving forward. We will be sure to post the links and information and registration in the chat box for all of you to look at. Joining you now is Sarah Torian with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Sierra. Welcome and Happy New Year, everyone. As we all know, 2020 was an incredibly challenging year for all of us. But amidst all of those challenges, many rose up and responded with Herculean efforts to reduce the negative impacts of the pandemic and the other challenges we faced. Our nation's teachers were certainly among those heroes. As we now reflect on the past year and plan for the next, the Campaign for Grade Level Reading felt it was incredibly appropriate to hear from teachers about what we have learned and what it will take to ensure that the 56 million children and youth who experienced school closures and disruptions over the past year receive the educational opportunities and other support that they need to succeed, especially the 28.5 million children in low-income families. In the past years, our educators had to quickly pivot to find new and innovative ways to meet the needs of the children in their classrooms. They had to learn new skills and approaches, adapting in-person instruction in ways that can engage, inspire, and educate children who are staring at their computer screens all day with Brady Bunch boxes of people's images in front of them. They reached out to children and families after hours and on weekends just to let them know that they cared about them and were there to support them. They delivered educational materials and food to their children that they were serving, and so much more. The list goes on. All while many of them were actually dealing with issues related to the pandemic in their own households. With more than half of U.S. students still in remote learning right now, with many others attending school in a hybrid model mixed with some in-person and some remote learning, we wanted to start this new year by hearing from teachers to understand how we can strengthen our efforts to reach, engage, and educate all children. So earlier today, we heard from the top 2 teacher leaders in the country, Becky Pringle of the NEA and Randi Weingarten of the AFT. And if you weren't able to join us for that earlier session, don't worry. We will include the link to that webinar recording in the follow-up email that we'll be sending out later on this week related to this session. But right now, we'd like to continue the conversation that we started earlier today by hearing from a panel of teacher leaders who will share their insights and their reflections on what we have learned to date and how we can move forward in a way that supports children. And to begin that conversation, I'm incredibly honored to welcome and introduce our panel. And because we are very eager to hear from them, I'm just going to be sharing very brief introductions for each of them. But please do know that longer bios are posted in a link in the chat box, so you can check that out there. First, I'd like to welcome and introduce Priscilla Forsythe. Priscilla is the head of programs for the New York region of Teach for America. She began her career in 1998 as a TFA Corps member, teaching for 5 years in Compton, California. And after several years of practicing law and holding various leadership positions with Lighthouse Academies, a national nonprofit charter management organization, Priscilla returned to her home in New York and rejoined Teach for America, working with and in partnership with schools and the school district where she herself attended school as a child. Also like to welcome Sanford Johnson. Sanford is the Mississippi Executive Director of Teach Plus and also leads the Mississippi Teaching Policy Fellowship. Before joining Teach Plus, Sanford co-founded Mississippi First, an education policy research and advocacy organization, and worked with educators to advance policy solutions in charter school development, school funding, and testing. Earlier in his career, Sanford taught high school social studies in the Mississippi Delta. Also like to welcome Dr. Calvin Moore Jr. Calvin is the CEO of the Council for Professional Recognition, the first CEO of the council to also hold its early education credential, the Child Development Associate, or CDA. Throughout his career, Calvin has held senior roles directing complex public departments at both the federal and state level, focused on improving outcomes for underserved children and families. Most recently serving as regional program manager in Atlanta for the Office of Head Start. Also like to introduce Jessica Tang. Jessica is the president of the Boston Teachers Union and also serves as vice president for the American Federation of Teachers, Massachusetts. Jessica began her career in Boston Public Schools as a college student volunteer tutor, later serving as a tutoring program director and then as a middle school social studies teacher. Next, I'd like to welcome and introduce Jeimee Estrada and Evan Stone, both of Educators for Excellence. Jeimee first, a graduate of LA Public Schools. Jeimee now serves as the Executive Director of Educators for Excellence, working in Los Angeles. She led parent organizing efforts previously at Innovate Public Schools in LA and has taught high school English and Spanish. And Evan Stone helped to found and now co-leads Educators for Excellence, leading the organization's advocacy, organizing, and growth strategies. While in college, Evan led Luther House Tutoring Program, joining Teach for America after graduation and teaching 6th grade in the Bronx in New York. So welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we get started hearing your thoughts on our current situation, what it's going to take to move forward, I'd love to invite each of you to share just a little bit more background about each of your organizations, where you're working and your connections with educators in that organization. And I thought we could follow the same order that we used for introductions. So starting with you first, Priscilla, can you tell us a little bit about Teach for America and TFA New York?
Sure, thanks so much. So Teach for America was founded in 1990, and essentially Teach for America recruits and develops a diverse core of outstanding leaders who make an initial 2-year commitment to teach in high-need schools and become lifelong leaders in the effort to end educational inequity. And so what that looks like in practice, of course, is the thing that I think most people think of when they think of Teach for America, which is brand new teachers in schools. And so I lead the team of folks in New York who focus on both onboarding, training, supporting and developing new teachers that we bring into New York City. So we have currently 340 core members teaching in over 140 schools in 4 boroughs. We're not in Staten Island. And I think something I just wanted to flag that I think is really important about Teach for America currently, that may be an update on some people's understanding of the organization, is just what an incredible pipeline for diversity in teaching. Teach for America is in New York, 64% of our teachers currently are people of color, identify as people of color, from 50% from low-income backgrounds, 37% first-generation college graduates, and about the same as what we're calling homegrown New Yorkers like myself. So really sharing the background of the students who we work with. And we, in New York in particular, have introduced over 6,000 leaders, Evan being one of them, into New York City schools over the last 30 years. So that's super exciting. And today I really bring the perspective, I think, of New York City new teachers teaching and navigating the world in this moment.
Thank you so much for that, Priscilla. Turning next, a very not New York City place, Sanford, coming to you. Can you tell us a little bit about Teach Plus and its work in Mississippi?
Yes, and yeah, I'm also a Teach for America alum too, so shout out there. Teach Plus provides an opportunity for excellent experience, a diverse set of teachers to help influence policy and practice decisions that will lead to equity, opportunity, and better student outcomes. There are basically 2 different camps within the Teach Plus family. We do a lot of work around professional learning and instructional leadership. So professional development in school districts and schools around 6 states. We also have teaching policy fellowships through which our teachers learn policy, education policy, research and advocacy skills, and then use those skills to help influence policy at the local, state, and national level. I have the honor of leading the Mississippi Teaching Policy Fellowship, where I work with 22 different teachers. Over 70% of our teachers are from the Mississippi Delta, so the rural northwest corner of Mississippi. We also have 6 teachers who work with us as part of our Arkansas Advisory Board. And right now our focuses are on career readiness, prioritizing stimulus funding that may be coming to the Magnolia State, trauma-informed education, as well as improving licensure policies. So we recognize that this is a major this is a very challenging moment for all of our schools and for all of our educators, but I'm really excited about the opportunity to work with educators as we look to solve some of these major challenges.
Thank you so much, Sanford. Turning to you now, Calvin, you're a little bit unique in this conversation in that your focus is on our early learning educators. So love to hear a little bit more about the Council for Professional Recognition and its work with and support of those educators.
Thanks, Sarah. The Council for Professional Recognition is the home of the National Child Development Associate Credentialing Program for early childhood professionals. And we believe, and have said for many years, that we believe it's the best first step in terms of teacher preparation. The CDA Council administers the program, which results in the awarding of the CDA to an early childhood professional based on a set of time-tested, research-based tools where we determine the competency of that early childhood professional using multiple pieces of evidence. To date, we've awarded over 800,000 CDAs across the country and the world. And on average, each year, pre-COVID, we administered 40,000 CDAs each year. So we believe we are unique in the early childhood space in terms of teacher preparation, and I'm delighted to be with you today.
Thank you, Calvin. Those are impressive numbers. So turning to you now, Jessica, can you tell us a little bit about the Boston Teachers Union?
Hi, everyone. Yep, happy to. My name is Jessica Tang, and I'm a middle school social studies and humanities teacher, serving my third term as my third year at the Boston Teachers Union. And Our mission is there, so I'm not going to read it, but we do proudly represent 10,000 educators in both district and charter schools. And we represent more than just educators, and teachers, but also professionals, for example, speech language therapists, occupational therapists, related service providers, school nurses, social workers, counselors, and many other school-based roles. And we have about 7,500 active members and 3,000 retired members. And we're also part of the American Federation of Teachers. We were founded in 1945, so we were the 66th local to join the AFT. And in addition to the work we do, obviously, in schools, we also are explicitly a social justice union and also advocate for social, racial, and economic justice beyond our schools, because we know that communities and schools are very much connected. And so in addition, we're part of a number of different national campaigns. So for example, Black Lives Matter at schools, Demand Safe Schools, and today is the National Day of Resistance. And that's happened to be today as well. And so shout out and solidarity to all of the 20 locals, NEA and AFT, that are part of that today. And we also do a lot of work in the local level. We have committees ranging from Climate Justice Committee to our Unafraid Educators Committee, which grew so big that it has its own website now, and started a scholarship for undocumented students. And we do a lot, we have a new Housing Justice Committee as well. And so again, you know, the work of our union is centered in education, but also very much centered on social, racial, and economic justice and all the other issues that impact our students and our educators and our communities.
Thank you, Jessica. Really lifting up kind of that whole child, all the different beyond educators, the staff in schools that are supporting children, and the whole community and what it takes to have a just community. Thank you. And then last but not least, I'd like to turn to Jeimee and Evan to tell us a little bit about Educators for Excellence, its work nationwide, and then also the work that it's doing in LA.
Great. Hi, everybody. It's great to be with you. My name is Evan Stone. I am a former 6th grade teacher and one of the co-founders and co-CEOs of Educators for Excellence, or as we call it, E4E. And I'm joined by my amazing colleague, Jeimee Estrada, who's our really amazing and incredible executive director in our Los Angeles chapter. I'm going to talk a little bit about our national work, and then I'll turn it over to Jeimee to hone in on their work in the Los Angeles landscape. So Educators for Excellence is a grassroots movement of nearly 35,000 educators across the country. We are united by a common declaration of principles and beliefs. We were founded just over a decade ago out of my and my co-founders' classrooms at PS 86 in the Bronx. And we were founded on a very simple premise that for far too long, teachers have been treated as subjects of change rather than as agents of change. And so we've been working over the last decade and growing to ensure teachers have the leading voice in shaping education policy that impacts their classrooms and their students, with the twin goals of increasing equity and excellence in education and elevating the teaching profession. We now work in 6 regions across the country. You can see those mapped out here with a growing network of teachers who are organizing and training and advocating for policy shifts that benefit their kids, and supporting teachers to take on leadership positions in their schools and in their districts, and probably most importantly in their unions. All of our chapters focus their organizing in large urban school districts. And so I bring the perspective of tens of thousands of urban educators who are committed to advocating for systemic change that will increase racial equity in our education system, that will improve quality, and that will set kids up for the lives that we know that they should be able to have. So with that, I will turn it over to Jeimee, who can talk a little bit about our work in Los Angeles.
Thanks, Evan, and hey, everyone. It's good to be with you in this really important conversation. So Jeimee Estrada, Executive Director in Educators for Excellence, Los Angeles. I have the incredible privilege of organizing with teachers that are serving the community that I grew up in, and former teacher, 9th and 10th grade high school and Spanish educator. And our work in Los Angeles, the flavor of it locally is, Los Angeles is a school district because of the amazing leadership of important leaders like Yoli Flores, who is facilitating our conversation today, is a district that is predominantly led by teachers of color, which matches the population that it serves. It's a district that has doubled down on social justice, on implementing restorative practices locally. And so the work that we center is how do we support educators to really lift up their voice and participate within their union, United Teachers Los Angeles, and also to participate in the policy decisions that are being made in the second largest school district in the country. So very excited to be with you all today.
Thank you all for that kind of introduction and background into the wonderful organizations that each of you are affiliated with. And I love the theme that I heard coming out there. So many of you kind of going back into your home districts and helping to support teachers and education there and playing leadership roles. That's wonderful to hear. So as Jeimee Estrada hinted, my colleague Yoli Flores is joining us in just a moment. So Yoli, the Chief Learning Officer for the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, hosted our earlier conversation that I referenced earlier with Becky Pringle and Randi Weingarten. And so Yoli, I'd wonder if you could share some highlights and recap some of the lessons learned that they lifted up in their conversation with you earlier today.
Sure, Sarah, thank you. And thanks for having me. I think this is the first time that we do a webinar together. You're either leading one and I'm doing the other, but this is an opportunity for us to have a 2-minute conversation before you really get to the panel. And thank you to this great group of folks that you have brought together, half of whom have been close colleagues and people that I admire. So really great to be on the webinar with you. So as you said, Sarah, this morning, we launched our very first webinar of 2021 in a conversation with Becky Pringle from the NEA and Randi Weingarten from the AFT, and they were each interviewed a few days ago. And it was a more extensive conversation. So with each, we recorded that conversation, about 20 minutes each. So a lot that they covered. Becky was interviewed by our colleague, Peggy Brookins from MBCT, and Wes Moore from Robin Hood interviewed Randi. And again, it was a very extensive conversation. First question was around the lessons learned over the last 10 months in terms of the impact of the pandemic on student learning. We asked about what Build Back Better meant to them, priorities that they would lift up to the new Secretary of Education designee, Dr. Cardona. So very robust and rich conversation. We have that recording for those of you who were not on there to listen to. So to start, Sarah, I think you wanted me to just lift up a few key themes that came up, and they're here. You could see them on the screen. And many of them are themes that we ourselves have picked up along the way, and as we've all lived through this very difficult time of COVID-19. The biggest learning, I think, across the board is that what we've known for decades really was further exposed and exacerbated, and those being the inequities that exist for way too many children, primarily children from families that are low income and children of color. So these underlying inequities were magnified to a degree that I think really shook many people, and that hopefully will deepen our focus on what kids need, all the supports that kids need in order for them to, as Becky said, I love this phrase, step into their brilliance. Secondly, and related to that, is a recognition. I'm a social worker, so those of us who are social workers have understood this for a long time, but I think the system as a whole has not. And that is that for children to learn and to succeed, we need to think about our work as educators in a more holistic way. That we need a whole child and a whole community approach. I think both, but especially Becky, recognized one of the campaign's mantras, actually, which is that schools cannot do this work alone. We tend to judge and blame schools for so much, but schools alone do not contribute to the challenges that our children face. And so this is why a whole community approach is so important. Third, and this is the experience that probably every panelist here has heard from their colleagues that are teaching, that the immediate pivot to distance learning or hybrid or whatnot, teachers had to step into that so suddenly with very little time to process, to learn, to plan, to think, to reflect, and that had a huge impact on kids. So really considering, recognizing, and attending to the fact that in general, teachers need that time. We need to honor teachers with the time that they need to deliver for our kids. And then finally, the learning that what has transpired over the last few months really was heroic and Herculean. And that there were so many that we need to lift up, recognize, and thank for their efforts, including nurses and teachers and all of those who played a role in trying to heal this nation while trying to serve our kids. So just a few snapshots of this morning's conversation. Some of you saw the pre-recorded interviews, so you'll probably tap into other parts of the conversation, but here are a few to begin with.
Thank you so much for that, Yoli. They were wonderful conversations. It was so interesting and insightful to hear everything that both the moderators and the presenters lifted up. So I'd like to welcome back in our panelists now. We've still got these lessons learned that Becky Pringle and Randi Weingarten lifted up during their interviews earlier today. I'd love to invite you to share your thoughts on which of these might resonate most with you and your experiences. And what would you add to the list? What are some of your other lessons learned that are not represented here? And I thought in responding to this question, we'd kind of flip the order that we went in previously. So starting first with you, Jeimee, if we could.
Yeah, of course, Sarah. You know, Yoli, what was really, I think, inspiring and important for me from Ms. Pringle and Ms. Weingarten from that conversation is, and I think across the entire country, but in each of our communities, there's a significant amount of alignment in seeing the problem for its enormity at this moment, right? Classrooms are in our homes right now. And for me, double time, my husband is a principal. And so he's running a 500 children school from the other room right now. And so, you know, we have our classrooms in our homes, and the American people have classrooms in their home. And so I want to say the alignment is substantial. We know that we've needed a whole child and whole community agenda for quite some time. And the challenges we're seeing with the digital divide are making that particularly clear. Emily just posted in the chat a survey, a poll, a scientific poll we did of educators along with the USC Rossier School of Education to really figure out what is the impact that educators are now feeling 10 months into the pandemic. This was a December poll. And 91% of educators reported that students are still experiencing, and teachers, technology problems daily. That is internet, basic connectivity. I'm living that at home. My husband's 500 children's school is logged out today from internet problems. That is a whole day of lost learning yesterday and today. That is happening across the board continuously. So what I would lift up is really that the challenges we've seen from the beginning of the pandemic until now have continued, have not been resolved, and the impact and the weight of that for our educators is very substantial. And so how we bring an entire community, our schools can't do this alone. Yes, our districts and schools are hubs. They are hubs of food, healthcare, internet, information to parents, hubs to our community that right now are being so strained to the breaking point. They need support. And we also need to listen to our educators and really understand the depth of the challenge that they're facing. And really this, teachers needing extra time to learn, think, and plan on how to really have a 21st century learning classroom online that hopefully they're gleaning the lessons of moving forward. Let's also not miss what's happening in this moment. Our teachers are finding new ways to engage students and understand mastery and learning. And at the same time, pain is happening in our communities now. And so what's our recovery agenda? And our president has really charged our local communities, our governor in California as well. And we don't have to wait until summer, until next year to figure out what we need to do with the pandemic. Let's listen to the data that we're seeing. Let's look at it from all of the communities across the country, from those regions that have gone hybrid, from those that have stayed entirely distance learning and those that have gone to in-person instruction. What can we learn about keeping educators and students safe? And what can we learn about how do we stop the pain now and recover from this tremendous challenge? And I think that, as is being introduced in the chat from Sandra, parents absolutely are at the heart of this as well. So how do we break down the silos? Those that are closest, one of the organizing principles I stand by is those that are closest to the problem should have the loudest voice in the solution and also know the solution best. That is an organizer's mantra. And that is our teachers and our parents and students right now. So how do we center their voices in a recovery plan that is substantial, but one that looks at the current state of our data on reopening and make some very solid decisions for our most vulnerable students?
That's wonderful. I was so caught up in what you were sharing, I forgot to unmute. Love that comment about those who are closest need to be loudest in thinking about the solutions to a challenge. So the parents, families, and educators. And then what are your thoughts? What on this list really resonates with you, and what would you add?
So one of the comments that NEA President Pringle talked about and that Yoli summarized was that the pandemic's exposed and exacerbated long-standing inequities that exist in our system. And that is what we see in all of the districts and all the communities where we work. That the connectivity issues, the engagement issues, the access to the safe learning environments, the access to supports where schools are reopening are just growing an opportunity gap that is already pernicious and terrible. I think it was President Weingarten who brought attention to the fact that 14 million students in 2021 don't have access to technology and reliable internet. I mean, that is just criminal that we are almost a year into this pandemic and still struggling with something that is so severe. The other thing that really resonated with me was the comment around collaboration. So President Weingarten talked about these are new problems, and President Pringle talked about this too. This is not something that we have gone through before. We don't have a solid playbook to follow. And so what they talked about is the need for adults to come together, partner, and find solutions. And right now in too many of the districts where we're working, there are exceptions. I think Boston is a great exception. So I'm excited to hear from Jessica Tang in a moment. But in too many districts, we have adults pointing fingers at each other, blaming each other, and fighting that is distracting from the solutions that our kids and families need in this moment. Whether those solutions are about safely reopening buildings or whether it's about radically improving the quality of distance learning, that needs to be the heart of our conversations that are happening between adults. And so I was really excited to hear that point leaned into by President Weingarten.
So Jessica, he was setting you up. How did he know that you were next in line? Love to hear what you would have to add to this list and which one really resonated with you.
Sure, I guess we're on the same page a little bit because I also had taken note of the was it 16 or 14 or 16 million students who didn't have internet access, and certainly had also noted Randi Weingarten's comment about 30 million students who get meals at schools. And so first of all of the takeaways resonated, but particularly around the need for a holistic response and holistic supports. And I think that is one of our learnings too, is that we've been advocating, I know NEA and AFT have both been advocating for community schools, this idea that we need wraparound supports and partnerships that extend beyond the school day, whether it be before school, after school, and also address health and adult needs as well. And so that certainly was something that I've seen, and I do believe there's some research on this too, that the schools that were better prepared and best prepared were the ones that already had a lot of those holistic community supports set up and in place. I mean, in Boston, we had to deliver, 35,000 Chromebooks in a matter of just a couple of weeks, figure out meal sites, all of the things that they talked about that schools do that I think the larger community doesn't realize that we do. And then I also appreciated Randi Weingarten's focus on how do we build back better? How do we ensure where we're not just going back to the status quo, because we know the status quo is not working. And there already were inequities that existed, and we cannot continue to ignore those inequities. And this has to be a movement where we're progressing forward. And so I struggle with this whole learning loss and concept, and I'll get into that later because I know that we're going to talk about it a little bit more. But I really think it's problematic when we're not thinking about asset-based approaches, especially with our students, families, and educators, and instead have a deficit framing, particularly when we talk about students of color. And so I appreciated the President Weingarten's comment about the resilience of students, and also the need for honesty, transparency, and, as Evan shared, collaboration. Because there is actually a lot that we've learned in terms of how we communicate better, how we have better relationships between educators and families and students. And in fact, that's one of the positives that I've heard, that some of the relationships actually are stronger than they've ever been before. So what's working that we need to continue to support and cultivate and continue to grow as we move forward too. So those are some of the takeaways I had, and similar to Jeimee, actually, my congresswoman, and get to call her friend because we've known each other for a while, Ayanna Pressley, always says the closest to the pain had to be closest to the power. And I think there were lost opportunities during this pandemic to really listen to those of us who are on the ground, whether they be educators, students, or parents and families. And to acknowledge, another one of her phrases that I love is, students don't come to school as independent contractors. They don't just, pick up and go to work at school and then go home. They're very much affected by everything that's going on around them. And so the emphasis on Maslow before Bloom, I think, is something that we really need to focus on too. The social emotional learning and the impacts moving forward are going to be significant, both for adults and students. And we've got to start thinking about how we're going to address that moving forward as well.
Thank you. So in the previous conversation earlier today, there were a lot of people that were asking about what about younger children? What about educators of younger children? So I'm excited to bring you into the conversation now, Calvin, in your role of working with and supporting early learning educators. So which of these lessons that Randi and Becky lifted up really resonate with you, or anything else that you heard in their presentations? And what would you add? What are your thoughts that you would add from that early learning space?
Thanks, Sarah. I do think that Jessica may be onto something. I think we wonder in early childhood about this learning loss concept. I also would say that several of these lessons learned that Yoli pointed out really resonated with me as an early childhood professional, particularly the long-standing inequities that exist. I know at the council, we've made a commitment to trying to reach the hard to reach early childhood professional, whether we're talking about linguistics, or we're talking about Black and Brown communities, or children that are learning on tribal communities, for example. All of those communities would need to be heard in terms of this learning loss concept. One of the things that resonated with me the most about these long-standing inequities is the way that school systems are financed, and then the paradigm of those leaders. The children show up at your door perhaps at 5, and if you're fortunate, you have a pre-K program, and so they may arrive at 4. But the children have been living for 3 years at that point, and so we have to understand that so much has been poured into those children prior to them showing up at the K-12 school. So we need to make sure that we recognize that early childhood professionals have been providing the foundational supports for young children for ad nauseum. I mean, that's what we do. And we've always been focused on child-centered curriculum. We've always been focused on the social and emotional development of our children and our families. And we've been focused on play-based curriculum. And so this whole notion of what's best for children when they're in remote learning spaces is what we do in early childhood. You know, they need really rich curricular experiences. There's environmental print all around them in their home environment, and we need to deepen the connection between schools and families, because in this particular situation, the family connection is really strong. So let's teach parents how to be better teachers when we recognize that they are the first and best teachers of their children.
Thank you. Another question that came up during the conversation earlier today was, what about rural communities? So Sanford, turning to you now, not that you need to only focus on rural, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on the lessons learned by Randi and Becky and what you would add. And in particular, I'd love to hear your thoughts about rural communities and the impact of the pandemic there on children and teachers.
Absolutely. So I was thinking about all of the challenges that students in Mississippi dealt with during the 2019-2020 school year. So it started off with like ice raids that disrupted several different families across the state of Mississippi, especially in some of our more rural areas. We went from that to, you know, the pandemic. In the middle of the pandemic, there were actually tornadoes that destroyed houses in a lot of our communities. Then we also had reminders that racism is still alive and well here in the state of Mississippi, like not just in the state of Mississippi, but across the country. And then in the middle of that, a very toxic political environment. So when you look at all of those things, these are things that our young people, our students, as well as our families, our teachers have had to deal with. When you think about the pandemic specifically, you've got to look at not only the economic impact of that. There were a lot of folks who lost jobs. Some of our students have had to, the older students have had to find part-time work to take care of their families. Some of our young people have had to watch their siblings because their parents had to work. If you were lucky enough to have technology, you probably had to share that laptop with another sibling who was also trying to do assignments. Our students have had to deal with a lot. And whenever we get back to close to normal within our schools, within our school districts, our educators are going to have to address those issues. So that is something to keep in mind. We also need to think about the fact that not only is Mississippi one of the poorest states in the country, but we also have this challenge of trying to turn an education system that was built during the days of Jim Crow and trying to transform it into a system that addresses the needs and educates every single child, regardless of your color or where you live in the state of Mississippi. So those were problems that took place even before the pandemic. So how do we get the resources? How do we get more teachers? How do we get the technology? One other thing that, and sort of to get back to this idea that our students have gone through so much, we really need to address social, emotional, and mental health needs of our students. So how are we training teachers to be able to identify when students are facing trauma? How do we make sure that those students have the resources, that they have the service providers that are necessary to treat whatever trauma is there? And we also need to look into the mental health needs of our teachers. Our teachers have gone through a lot. So there's just a lot that needs to be addressed. There were a lot of challenges before the pandemic, but now the pandemic has shown that there are some additional needs that need to be addressed.
Thank you, and made them harder to deny. People who were denying them, I feel like there's a light that makes it harder to ignore now.
And it's
Priscilla,
not just Mississippi, yes.
Right, yes, that's a national, yeah, definitely. Turning to you now, Priscilla, which of these lessons learned really resonates with you? What would you add? What are your thoughts?
I mean, it all resonates so deeply, particularly all the points around the systemic implications of this moment and the needs there. We can't really fix anything through any single teacher or school alone. It's going to take the entire system working in concert, this concept of collaborative and collective leadership. And there have been some bright spots and examples of that. And I've seen it impacting brand new teachers in schools where there's been tremendous leadership and community partnership that has led to just such different outcomes. And so I think there's a lot of bright spots to mine. But the thing that I guess I would I mean, I wrote down a list of learnings, and then I was feeling really passionate about them. And then when I looked at it, I realized I already knew all of these things, which I think is really important to highlight here. And it's been said before. Yes, the circumstances of the pandemic itself are new and they're different, and we haven't faced them. But the underlying issues that resulted in the calamity that it is, those have been in existence for a really long time. And we know what those things are, what that inequity looks like, and the ways it plays out. We're just seeing a new version of it in action. And so, you know, I think for me, something that, again, I already knew before and that we've been working on in the last 4 years to do better, is really thinking about this last point that Sanford shared about teachers' emotional resilience and supports for that. It's not something that's just going to happen if we don't actually support it. So this idea of our teachers need time to figure out and make these pivots, yes, but they also need a tremendous amount of love and care and support. And I think, like, we talk a lot about the whole child, and there's also the whole teacher. And I just think those two things cannot be separated. And in that, I think also the sense of community and belonging that our teachers feel alongside the colleagues they work with at schools, and the other ways they can create community with folks, particularly we see with new teachers, having community with other new teachers, and the strength that that brings for them to face the challenges. It's just that everyone is experiencing tremendous trauma. Teachers, either themselves in their own personal lives, but also vicariously, you know, through the challenges that their students are experiencing too. I've never seen so much love and care, but there's also just a real danger if we don't stop to take care of our teachers' wellness. And then the final thing I would just say is the power of coaching and one-on-one supporting people in the context in which they work has been really fascinating to see, particularly as we kicked off this year with folks who have never taught before in their lives, and but with the very close holding and supporting of someone who has more experience. We've just seen that they can do amazing, even brand new teachers in this circumstance can do amazing things. So those are the only things I would add.
Thank you. Those are wonderful points, remembering that the supports that teachers need who are dealing with this at the same time that we're thinking about the children. Thank you all for those thoughts. So next week's GLR Learning Tuesdays webinar is going to start digging into some of the data on the projected impact of COVID-19 related learning disruptions. A summer 2020 report by McKinsey & Company estimated that students in low-income families might fall as more than 12 months behind if in-class instruction did not resume by January 2021. That's this month. Also said that Black and Hispanic students were at risk of losing significantly more than their white counterparts. So currently, less than 1/3, or actually, currently less than 1/3 of students are receiving in-person instruction every day, with about 15% more receiving education through hybrid models. So they're in-person part of the time and remote learning the other part of the time, suggesting that that summer prediction may in fact come to fruition. So some of the strategies that the Campaign for Grade Level Reading has lifted up in response to this challenge are to close the digital divide, to enable virtual learning for all students. Many of you were talking about the huge gap, the millions that now 10 months later still don't have access to devices, internet broadband connectivity, and the assistance that they need to use those devices and that internet. And that's a lot of progress has been made since this started in March. Also looking at providing high dosage tutoring to help children and students catch up. And we're going to be we posted a number of webinars about both of these topics, and so we're posting links to those webinars in the chat box right now. But as we accelerate recovery efforts, we're also looking at education technology and strategies to support and equip parents in their roles as essential partners as being critical in this work. And many of you have touched on certainly the role that parents play in supporting children, and the way that, and the importance of reaching out and really partnering with them in this moment and always. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, each of you. on these and other approaches and how they can be deployed as a part of our collective effort to support teachers and their students in making up for the lost instructional time that they've experienced. And love to start this question with you, Jessica, if we could.
Thanks so much. So absolutely, and I have to say, I take the McKinsey report with a grain of salt, just because of my own experience in Boston, where a few years ago they did an audit of BPS and suggested the district could save up to $85 million a year by closing 40% of its schools. And then when the audit was dug into a bit more, it turns out they just basically took the square footage of all the buildings and divided it by the class size maximum without consideration for special education classroom sizes, space for OTs, PTs, SLPs, for sensory rooms and all other types of needs for space in schools. And so it was largely debunked. And I just want to point that out, that actually I think John Ewing, who's the president of Math for America, who I think I saw someone put the link for that about the learning loss, or I think it was called The Ridiculous of Learning Loss. And he pointed out that, while it may have been calculated from a mathematical formula, formulas are only as good as the data and the assumptions that go with it. So I just think that we need to, think a little bit how we're framing this conversation and what learning loss really even means. Because as educators, we know that, and he mentions this too, that you can step away from a topic for a while, and anyone, even any of us adults, may take time to recollect the bits and pieces and then reassemble that learning. But learning is complicated. And so the absence of learning, I think, is what he points out, and that I agree, is what we're most concerned about. But we have to do it in a way that is centered in equity. So, and again, it's not even just about the learning, it's about the other pieces that impact students holistically. But there are ways that, again, I think we had a lot of learnings, and to Priscilla's point, a lot of this we knew already. It didn't change during the pandemic. I think if anything, it just became even more important that we center what we know and beef it up, really. And so as we think about how we move towards progress and equity, again, the importance of collaboration, I can share in Boston that we are going to be starting a joint district and union reopening task force for the fall. And even before then, also putting together a summer learning task force, so that we can bring together different stakeholders in the district and really think forward about what we can continue to support. And families is a big piece of it. And for our union, actually, we're on our own doing a lot of work with families, and in a couple of weeks are going to be having a online forum for parents and families of students with special needs, and how to figure out what are things that we can help our parents and families at home supporting students, whether if they're choosing to be remote instead of in person, what can we do to support them? But again, I do think that this is absolutely an important time to ensure that we do have those community schools, those partnerships that are happening in integration with the schools, so that it's not just schools that have partnerships. I think we see that a lot. And it's a little haphazard sometimes how these partnerships come to be with these schools. And so if we want to follow the community schools, or hub schools model, we'll call them in Boston, we really have to do that asset assessment. What's working, what's not, where are we need to ask families, what is it that they need supports with? What do the students need support with? What do the educators need support with? And then figure out how we integrate all those pieces and get the supports from the city and the district, and have much more comprehensive plans moving forward. And that may include technology for sure. And again, I think we just need to get the basics right still. Chromebooks are great, but there are limitations to Chromebooks. The Wi-Fi access is still very spotty for a lot of our students. We have, short-term Wi-Fi access. We need long-term solutions. I know Senator Markey has been promoting the E-rates and accessibility, not just schools for internet, but also in libraries and computers where you have the Wi-Fi built in. And so just access is certainly still a huge priority. And then then we can also continue to utilize a lot of these applications. I'm so impressed. I mean, I spend time going into schools virtually all the time to stay grounded and visit classrooms. And there is just some incredible work happening. And even for our EL students, some of them actually, their effective filter has been lowered. And so they're doing actually better remotely. And so there are just a lot of lessons to be learned. And I think those are some of them. But we've got to bring everyone to the table and figure out those solutions together.
Great. I love that point about the collaboration and making sure that all of those voices are heard as we think about how to provide the supports that kids need. Love to hear your thoughts now, Sanford, in terms of your experience working with schools and educators and students in Mississippi.
Yes. So just to pretty much agree with everybody else. Closing the digital divide is something that is a major issue here in the Mississippi Delta. And I live in a town with 18,000. So fortunately, we have pretty good access to internet, although I was really scared that the internet was going to go out right before the Zoom meeting today. But out in like the county and other parts of the Delta, like access is very limited. You still have students who are trying to do homework assignments in the McDonald's parking lot right now. And it's not just a problem for right now, but it's also a challenge that we need to meet in the future. Like, what is technology going to look like? How do we incorporate it into like everyday learning? How are we preparing teachers to just incorporate it into their instruction? Another thing that I'm really interested in is if there's an opportunity to connect increasing clinical experience for aspiring teachers with the need for tutoring. So can we build better partnerships between our teacher prep programs and our schools? And then the last thing I want to focus on is all the technical assistance that our students are going to need, that our parents are going to need. A lot of our parents are not, they're learning the technology as well. So are there resources within schools, within districts where parents can get additional help, where students can get additional help? So those are the things that I'm really focused on here in Mississippi.
Thank you for that. As a person who's lived working off of my computer for decades, even I'm struggling with the parent role in terms of using the technology to support my children as they've been doing virtual school. So Priscilla, turning to you now, what are your thoughts about the disproportionate impact of what we've experienced over the past 10 months and how we can utilize efforts to close the digital divide, advance, promote tutoring, education technology, partnerships with parents to help support kids and teachers?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think what's been said by Jessica and Sanford and all the list of ideas, I think they're all really right and good. I think the thing I'm finding myself feel like nervousness in my stomach or a little anxiety around is this tendency, particularly with using terms like learning loss, it creates this anxiety and this sense of urgency to hurry up and find the solution and just like put it in. And I think to Jessica's point, it feels like the problem is so much deeper than a quick fix, so much. And so it's not to say that no, tutoring won't work. I just don't want us to get caught up in the quick fixes to spite the bigger, more important systemic changes that need to be made. And to Jessica's point, like how we cannot take a top-down approach to fixing those things, but really engage teachers, parents, students in thinking through what that needs to look like. Because I used to run a tutoring program actually when I was in Compton, and we trained parents and high school students and other community members to be the tutors, which was awesome in theory. But I think, I just remember some of the ways in which that program felt still to kids a little bit like it wasn't meeting their needs. And I just think it felt a little bit too much like regular remediation was the word it felt like. And just, we have to think about healing the students and the teachers and ourselves and our community, but also our broken systems, and really taking a different approach. So again, like the quick fixes, I jump to those because I'm a real fixer, but I'm really trying to temper this sense of urgency, because while it is urgent and important, if we just kind of revert back to quick fixes, we're ultimately going to find ourselves in a similar position the next time something like this happens.
Certainly, and that's great points that you're all lifting up. And I do want to clarify that even though these examples that I've lifted up of some of the approaches that the campaign has been identifying and advancing are not intended to be like one-off things, but a part of a holistic system-wide approach, and really focusing on building back better and recognizing that the system has been broken for centuries since public education started, and what it's going to take to really change that. And
yes, and I could jump in and just say, and to clarify, like, so they're all good things. It's just how we go about implementing them, I think, is what I'm sort of getting at. But thank you for that. Yeah.
Thank you. So turning to you now, Jeimee, love to hear your thoughts.
Sure. You know, as leaders in this space and as folks connected to educators, I think what we're raising up is we are facing some incredibly complex issues where multiple ideas really need to be discussed and put out in the public arena and be hashed out. The concept of learning loss as, a deficit mindset, I definitely understand that. And it's limited in that perspective that what happens at school is more than learning. What happens at school is social connection, mental health support, students get fed, students have access to healthcare, et cetera, especially in our lowest income communities. But we also, one core element of the teaching profession is how do we advance the learning capacity of students to reach their spark, as Becky Pringle said, and that how essential it is for students to be able to learn to read, to master that praxis, right? As an educator, the focus of learning in my classroom was how do I create a safe space for practice, for messing up, for doing it all over again, and mastering and showing, and students be able to show that spark. And I think we have absolutely seen educators in Los Angeles that are making that happen in a digital environment. So I want to double down on Jessica's statement that we need to learn from the bright spots here. And back to my statement before, 21st century learning, there were some schools that were doing it and were practicing with it and figuring out how do we advance and have different structures in classrooms that allow students to move at their own paces, to do project-based learning. And that's exciting because this is forcing us to go a little bit faster. But I don't want to I don't want to miss out on the opportunity to have a very robust conversation of when we have suffered the trauma that we are suffering right now, that we need recovery, that we actually need healing and recovery, and that we need people that are both focused on the short term. So, next week in Los Angeles, the questions around what teachers will be vaccinated, what community members will be vaccinated in order to reopen our full economy and reopen our schools, that is an essential question of now. That cannot wait, and it is a public policy decision that needs a team. So I think as leaders in this space that are working with educators, we need to think about what are the things that need urgent solutions now, because families are suffering, students are suffering, and educators are. We did a poll of Los Angeles teachers, and 94% of them are caretakers themselves. And so what does it mean? I mean, all of us, you all might have little ones at home. I have a 3-year-old. And what this means for her inability to return to daycare is massive for me. And that is urgent. And so we need people that are grounded in urgent solutions. And we also need people that are grounded in the long-term work of redesigning an education system that has been racist, classist, and inadequate for all of our kids. And both of those sort of teams of people, our thought leaders, our educators, need to come together to connect the dots. And so with this, for CGLR, I applaud you. Tutoring, can be tutoring is one-on-one interaction between an adult and a student that has social connection, emotion to share, as well as learning capacity to share. And that's actually what's just happening in all the rich communities. Let's just be real, that tutoring is taking place all over the country in our most affluent communities. And so that one-on-one support, learning pods, in-person instruction. I live in Los Angeles. La Cañada Flint Ridge up the road has been reopened K2 without significant problems for their educators. But in Los Angeles, where we are at the epicenter of the crisis now, and so this is not to say that return to schools is the solution, but how do we have fact-based conversations around what our kids need and know that some are the haves and some are the have-nots right now. And the have-nots, we asked educators, what students are you regularly meeting the needs of in this crazy environment, acknowledging that you need more support. Teachers across Los Angeles said only 10% of homeless students are having their needs met that are connected to a school, not their total needs met, but their school needs met, only 10%. 14% for LGBTQ students, 16% for students with disabilities. So there's 16% of teachers in a district as large as Los Angeles said that those students with disabilities needs are being met in this current environment. So I appreciate the long-term view around where we need to go, and I absolutely agree with it, but I don't want us to discount the reality of what's happening now, which is major loss, and I think we are doing ourselves a disservice by just calling it learning loss. It is the presence of school, mental health, connection to adults. It is loss, it is trauma, and we need to heal.
Great points. Certainly, it gets back to that whole child, whole community, that there's the learning portion, but there's also the impact on the child's family and the community around them, and that all of that is a part of the response that's needed. Evan, love to hear your thoughts.
Wow, that was just a really powerful answer by Jeimee. And so I'm thinking a lot about the question of learning loss, the term learning loss, and I agree that there are real concerns with it. It is deficit-minded, but I also just completely agree with Jaimee's point that what we are hearing from teachers is that there have been significant learning opportunities, significant developmental opportunities, significant growth opportunities that have been diminished during this pandemic. So we should get the language right, because we do not want to say that this is, we don't want to come in this with a deficit mindset, but we should also accept that across all student demographics, all grades, all school types, what we're hearing is more than half of teachers are reporting that student learning, student completion rates of homework and assignments, student participation and engagement rates, student attendance is worse than before the pandemic. And although that is true for all groups of students, it is particularly true for students who've been historically marginalized and oppressed by our system. The concerns for those kids are significantly higher from educators. And so then when I back up and ask the question, so what do we do about this? And when we've asked teachers this, and the vast majority tell us they want to actually keep grade and promotion criteria in place. They don't want to lower expectations to sort of push kids through the system, but they want to add support. They want to add all of the wraparound services that have been described by these other incredible panelists. They're also telling us there's some things that we've never fixed that we need to get right. Some fundamental pieces of education that have been broken for too long. One of which we keep hearing about is curriculum. So half of teachers tell us that even now, 12 years into the Common Core, 10 years into the Common Core, curriculum is still not standard aligned. It's still not high quality. They don't have texts that are on grade level for students. A third of teachers say their curriculum isn't representative of the identities and the culture of their students, or only a third say it is. So 2/3 of teachers are saying, I have, a curriculum that represents all white authors, yet I'm teaching a population of majority students of color. And only 30% of teachers told us that their curriculum is adaptable for to go online. So all of the tools and resources that would have made this easier were broken to begin with. And so one of the things that I hope we do is go back and address some of the fundamental pieces that have been flawed for too long. And that's ensuring that kids have access to rigorous, relevant, high quality curricular tools so that teachers can do that. And on the question of then, what do teachers think we need to do? We are hearing loud and clear, we need more time. We did lose time through this. And they're open to lots of ideas. They're open to year-round school if they're compensated for it. They're open to a mandatory summer school sessions for all students, especially if they're compensated for it. They're open to intensive tutoring programs. But one of the things they tell us about the tutoring that I wanted to raise here is that it needs to be embedded. We need to find ways to connect it to the work that's going on in the classroom, because there's ample research that shows us that tutoring can be extremely beneficial if it's embedded, and the communities that Jeimee described are doing that already. And so how do we make sure that we don't create another separate ancillary system away from what's going on in classrooms and teachers, and actually find a way to really integrate these additional resources? But the last thing I think is, like, at the end of the day, this is about, are we going to put resources into our communities that need it the most? Are we going to finally say that our funding formulas, and this was raised by both our union presidents, are fundamentally inequitable, and that if we're going to even begin to address the diminished opportunities to learn that students have had, we need to fundamentally shift how we're prioritizing where funds go, increase the pie so there is more money, but also disproportionately send this into the communities that have been historically oppressed and marginalized by our education system. So those are some of the things that I think are foundational to being able to repair the damage and the trauma that has been pushed onto communities by this pandemic and by our nation's response to it.
Yeah, really appreciate those points. Calvin, turning to you now in terms of that early educator perspective, what are your thoughts on how we can support?
Yeah, so much of what's been said, by the way, is admirable, and I think it's exactly where folks in the K-12 system need to be, particularly considering the enormous challenge. But so much of it doesn't translate to early childhood professionals. I mean, in early childhood, what we know is that children learn from constructing knowledge based on their hands-on experiences with materials and things in their environment around them. And so what early childhood professionals have been attempting to do is to take advantage of their new learning environment, right? Which happens to be at home. And so what we've tried to tap into are those creative ways in which early childhood professionals are exploiting the home learning environment, right? And whether or not they have the capacity to provide those materials and experiences to the parents in the home. So I've heard early childhood professionals talk about lending libraries and backpack initiatives where they're providing those materials and those books that parents may not have at their disposal in the home learning environment, and giving those to the parents or loaning them to the parents during this remote learning experience. Another thing that we've been trying to put forward from the CDA perspective is we really need to be funding early childhood coaches so that teachers can better understand how to do remote learning right. And as we are going through this pandemic, we need to be learning about this new apparatus and how to best facilitate it, and then having coaches who are really experienced in facilitating that provide that experience for our early childhood professionals. And then finally, I would say that when we talk about learning loss, I agree with my panelists that that's probably not the right vernacular. But what is really being lost is formal instruction time. And so we need to make sure that that's how we view it, because children are always learning, right? But it's the instruction, it's that formal instruction that normally happens in the school, that dance between the teacher and the child, that is probably missing. And so what we've been telling our early childhood teachers is assess, assess, assess. Always know what your students know and what they need to know, and then read, 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 because a deep, rich piece of literature will save your life.
Thank you. That's a wonderful point. I'd like to turn it back to Yoli Flores now to share a little bit more about some responses to this, and then also the perspective of the campaign.
Well, first, I really want to throw a question back out. It was sort of embedded in the list of things that the campaign is lifting up as critical ways that we can support kids whose learning was so disrupted for all the reasons that we've talked about. And that's the question around ed technology. You know, what is the role of ed tech? There are a lot of new players in the field, whether it's Dreambox or Booknook, a lot of other products and tools that we're seeing have incredible impact. And to Jaimee's point, that we know wealthier families and their kids have access to, and they get to have quite a deeper opportunity to learn in other ways. And so if I could ask that question and then come back to me, and I'll just share a little bit of the perspective of the campaign overall.
Well, necessity, what is that term? Necessity is the mother of all invention. I think ed technology is really hot right now, and really thinking deeply about how this pandemic will transform, I think, the way in which we use technology. And I think we need to think of it as a bridge between, as I said, deepening the connection between the school and the family. And I think it's not just the software, but the hardware as well that we need to tap into. And then utilizing those ways in which we can continually tap in to the family and the child at home, because it's not just a regular schedule. I think most of my early childhood professionals say they've been FaceTiming with families right before they go to the table for supper, because that's the time when everybody's there and they really can make use of those really neat conversations. So giving them a conversation ticket and doing that through FaceTime technology. So I think it's really important for us to push innovation during the time of the pandemic, and then our counterparts who are working on innovating, give them all our good ideas during this time, because I think they can take advantage of it.
And I would just build on what Calvin said to say that if there is any small silver lining that comes out of this, we are hearing from the vast majority of teachers that we're talking to that they have learned new ways to integrate technology into their teaching. A few things that they've said it's been most helpful with is communicating with families. So setting up meetings, being able to connect to families. We knew the parent-teacher conference was long broken to require parents to come into schools and sit across a little desk and like get their report that the relationship between families and schools, that damaged it, and this has created real access. We've seen teachers talk about their ability to shift how they're spending their time. Larger convenings of students broken up into smaller groups. The technology's allowed them to do that. More rapid formative data that they're able to gather back about student performance that allows them to more rapidly shift their practice, where they're spending less time on the sort of grading, assessing, measuring, and more time on the grouping, instructing, and teaching. So I won't endorse specific technological platforms because I don't know that I know them well enough to do that. But I do think that teachers are telling us there are some things from this that they are absolutely going to bring back into their classroom to allow them to better differentiate instruction, which has been a long challenge, to better communicate and engage their families and parents, and to shift how they're spending their time so that they're spending more of their time instructing and teaching and less of their time on some of the behind the scenes paperwork. So that's some of the hopes that I have for where technology can take us.
You know, I lost a little bit of the order, so correct me if I'm jumping in here, Sarah and Yoli. But what I did want to mention, you know, in coming into the profession, and the first school that I taught was a project-based learning-oriented school. And I think one of the most important things to underscore as we lean into the moment of innovation when possible and really take care of our teachers and students is that nothing can replace the magic that happens in the classroom, that our adults, you know, show up to every day with students, and that technology, you know, even in technology-rich schools, is a tool. And what it does for educators is that it allows you to think about your role as an educator just more creatively. How do you better use your time? And that is sort of using technology in in-person classrooms. I think if we're successful as educators, our students are doing the majority of the thinking and talking, and we are listening and facilitating. And there are a variety of tech tools that allow educators to do that. I think that's what's promising about this moment is we're thinking about different ways to for students to show their work. One of our members in Los Angeles talked about, you know, typically when a question is put out into the classroom, he's a history teacher in the Valley. And when a question's put out into the classroom, you have students that raise their hand quickly. And, you know, as an educator, you figure out how to actually disperse that thinking in your classroom really well, rather than choose the first student. But then going beyond that, how do you use print, the Zoom chat, breakout classrooms, all the different elements, along with all of the different technology tools to have students move at their own pace, show different levels of mastery, and then have different ways, as Jessica mentioned, English learners being able to move a little bit of that, remove that affective filter. I think there's a lot of possibility here, and really looking at those promising practices is really essential, especially when it comes to the tools that have been most effective in supporting educators.
Great. So Sarah, the last thing I'll add, because it's been talked about a lot, is the campaign's very intentional use of learning loss. And I know you all have different perspectives around that. And that's because we are deeply, deeply concerned at the instructional lost time for kids, what that could represent, the catastrophe over a generation of kids, if we don't put that front and center, not as this was the child's fault, obviously, but it's demanding of us that we act, and we act now with urgency. And what we've seen for decades is too many low-income kids who, for whatever reason, are not at pace, and we forget about them. If you look at how many kids are not reading at grade level in 3rd grade, they still didn't read at grade level in 4th grade or in 5th grade or in 6th grade, and we just allow that to continue. And what we're saying is that we've got to take this moment, acknowledge what has happened, and do everything possible that wealthy families would do for their children. And we've got to step into that. And whether it's high dosage tutoring or using better use of technology, or actually it's not even or, it's and, investing in that relationship with parents, thinking about summer and camps for kids, all the things that other kids have access to because they have wealth. We need that, and we should demand that for our kids. So I'll get off of my box, but that's the position of the campaign. And we really do appreciate all the different perspectives here.
Thank you for sharing that, Yoli. And I'd also like to point out we've now posted the evaluation survey that Sierra mentioned when she was opening up the webinar. So I'd encourage you all to take a moment to share your thoughts through that. It really helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement, while we will continue going through some of the questions that you all have posted and hearing the thoughts of the panelists on that. One I'd like to start with is from S.Y. Mason Watson, who says that, we've heard several of you lift up the fact, and Randi and Becky mentioned it earlier in the previous webinar, we keep hearing the depths of the known inequities that has been exposed and revealed through the pandemic, and more people are aware of it. But on the other hand, we also hear that Black and brown children especially are projected to experience the most significant learning loss because of the pandemic and that lost instruction time. So what is the correlation between these two? And more importantly, I think, what strategies are being developed to support the children who have been most impacted, both through academically, but also that trauma and the social emotional impact on these children? Who would like to jump in and respond to that first?
I think these are good questions, and I did want to actually follow up to Jolie's point that I think even pre-pandemic, we absolutely did have a problem where because we know that students are learning to read until about 3rd grade, and then 3rd grade they're reading to learn, and if they aren't reading by then they're very likely to continue to fall behind in other subject areas, etc. And so we have to have massive interventions at that level. And actually, I was just speaking to the superintendent, I think it was yesterday, about what are the interventions we need to put into place for our early ed students, particularly ones that are already falling behind reading levels. And again, I appreciate too that I didn't mean to derail the conversations around learning loss. I just thought it was important to point out that there's we do need to stay, I think, centered in the assets of our students, particularly our students of color. And of course, there are ways in which I think students are falling behind, but that's due to so many of the other conditions that we've already discussed. And so it can't just be focused on the test score or the level. There's much more to learning than that. And going back to Maslow before Bloom, if we are not addressing the students' safety, their security, their social emotional health, et cetera, we're not going to get to Bloom's taxonomy of learning. And so that's why I strongly feel that the solutions ahead have to be holistic and in terms of leveling the playing field and the equity pieces, it's not just about the technology we can use, but that can actually even further exacerbate inequities if we haven't actually provided all of our students the access to technology in the first place. I mean, that's what we saw happening already. A lot of the schools that already had one-for-one laptops for all their students were able to much more quickly transition to remote learning. But we are in districts where students don't even have typing classes. And so one of the positives, sadly, that came out of this pandemic is that I think a lot more students have access to technology they never had before and know how to, we were teaching students how to turn, just plug in and charge computers, et cetera. So I think I'm getting off topic a little bit, but I did want to acknowledge.
They now know how to be on Zoom with us too.
Yeah, I mean, our second graders just like more proficient than adults on how to mute themselves and turn their cameras on.
Let's be clear. Let's be clear. We are dealing with a catastrophe.
Yeah.
The children that are most affected by this pandemic were already behind.
That's right.
Prior to COVID.
That's right.
So this is a generation of children that will be so dramatically affected by this crisis because of our previous inaction.
That's right.
That this is an emergency for our country.
Yeah.
They were most affected by the inequities of the system that had existed for centuries, and now they're most affected by the challenges that we're facing now. I agree. Would anyone else like to add any thoughts to that question or something else?
Yeah, I would add, just wondering what assessment is going to look like over the next year or two. We have to measure where our students are, knowing that, the way we tested and accountability definitely will not look the way it did like last year, the year before, but we do need to have that data. I also want to know, we also need to assess where our students are in terms of their social and emotional health. So are we doing wellness checks with our students? Are we putting systems in place to ensure that we can identify when students are dealing with trauma and being able to provide them the resources that they need? So I just want to make sure that we're measuring what's going on and making sure that we get that important data.
And measuring in a way that supports and informs efforts to help kids catch up. Evan, what were you going to add?
Yeah, so I just wanted to jump in and say we shouldn't be surprised that this pandemic had a disproportionate impact on students of color. I mean, that is how racism and white supremacy have worked in this country forever. And so the thing that I just want to add to this is that if we act shocked by it, then we act like, oh, it wouldn't happen again if there was any other calamity in a community, whether it's the tornadoes that Sanford described in Mississippi, or floods in another community. We see that these always are impacting communities of color disproportionately, students with special needs disproportionately, students coming from low-income backgrounds disproportionately. And so hopefully this calamity is so massive that it forces an action to begin to correct some of the systemic inequities that exist. Both the union presidents talked about funding as a component of that. I think that is one. I think it's access to great teachers is another. It's access to the high quality resources and tools, whether that's computers or typing classes, as Jessica Tang just mentioned. I think that the list is almost endless, but hopefully this calamity is such a size that it actually forces us to reassess some of the foundational inequities that exist in our system. And so I just I want to make sure that we can be shocked, but we can't be surprised that the system works how we designed it to.
Certainly, very good point. I mean, the results that we're getting are the results that we set ourselves up for. And we don't want the children to pay the price for that. Yeah.
Can I just add one more thing? Because I agree with everything that Evan just said, and that's kind of the point too, right? It took a pandemic for students to get laptops. You know, it took a pandemic to fix our school buildings that had been completely underinvested in for decades, and that's why we don't have HVAC or appropriate air filters or windows that open because they've been broken for so long, et cetera. And then it shouldn't have been that way. And so I totally agree with everyone said. The only thing I think that gives me hope is that this problem is not a new problem. And this is what we've been trained to do as educators, is to catch students up constantly. And because we do take, bring in students, we have students coming, we've had so many students from Puerto Rico and Haiti when the natural disasters hit. We had students from New Orleans, actually. I had when I was in the classroom, 2 students who had moved from New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And so we, again, have to go back to what we know how to do well. And that is what gives me hope in being able to move forward. But all those other pieces hopefully will actually be there this time that we haven't had for so long.
One question, many of you have talked, and I know we're about to wrap up, but Alan Gutman had asked about if there's any research that can be tapped into, recognizing that this is affecting children in so many ways, and it's been a trauma that experienced, but research around how to best heal, nurture learning, restore the best child engagement, including therapeutic approach to these systemic issues that we're talking about. Anything that we could learn from, whether it's communities like New Orleans and Katrina or other countries that have experienced traumas, whether from war or natural disasters. Is anybody aware of that? Anything like that that we could learn from?
I mean, on this point, I can't speak to the specific strategies that have been used. So I want to cede, space to answering the question around, communities as a scale that have experienced trauma. I would say the day-to-day trauma that comes in living in very vibrant communities whose potential is limited by, economic hardship, by so many elements, especially right now, if we think about our families that are Black and brown are seeing higher proportions of COVID infection as well as deaths. I too, like Jessica, find a lot of hope in that as teachers, you experience this daily. And so how do we get more serious about the fact that this has been the teacher's role for quite some time, and it should not be their role alone. And so that the best long-term solutions we can think about here are how do we right-size the supports for a system that we generally believe is worth more. Like, we agree that our students are worth more, that our educators are worth more, and we are falling behind on the investments level that it would take to get there. In California, we've seen some deeper investments in this upcoming budget. Our future soon-to-be administration is moving this direction of deeper investments, but we need to go broader. And so I think some of what comes next is around funding formulas that are truly equitable, so that we have the groundwork to make bigger investments where those resources are going where they're most needed. So I don't want to cede the airtime from the question that's fundamental, but I think there's a lot of resilience in communities that's here in our immigrant communities, in communities here at home, our African-American community, our Latinx community that have experienced trauma, our Native communities. And so we can heal ourselves if we have time and space. But if our communities, especially those most hard hit, are worrying about the next paycheck, how can they provide the space at home for their children to heal? If they're worried about going out to work without a vaccine and being infected, how can our children heal at home with their primary educators, which are their parents? So I think we need to go to solutions that are beyond education to solve this.
Right, great points. I mean, it is that whole child, that whole community, that whole country approach that we really need to the systemic change. I'm sorry, Evan, did you want to jump in really quickly because then we'll wrap up?
Sure, I wanted to share a group of our educators in Chicago are running a whole campaign around how to deal with some of the trauma and social emotional impact on this. And they're focused on 5 areas, 3 of which I would throw out there. The first is needs assessment and screening, which needs to be integrated into the sort of assessments and screening that we're doing to check for traumas and begin to identify them and set up supports. The second is trauma-informed instruction. Like the core of this is building healthy, positive relationships between teachers and students and training and supporting teachers to do that. And then the third thing is the number of mental health providers and supports we have in schools, which is still dramatically way too small. The ratio of counselors to students is massive, and as a result of that, kids aren't able to get the services and needs that they absolutely need, especially coming back from this pandemic. And the distribution of those counselors is once again inequitable. So I think those are 3 of the areas that we're focused on a lot to think about how we can address this.
Thank you. And I wanted to point out that Jessica has posted a link in the chat box that with some resources that can get to address this question. And just wanted to remind everybody that we'll be sending a follow-up email that will come out either late this week or early next week that will include all of the resources that were posted in the chat box by our panelists during this conversation. I want to say a huge thank you to all of you. I know we've gone well over our 90 minutes together, and we've still got well over 100 people listening in. So obviously there's a lot of interest in what you're sharing. So thank you for joining us today. Just want to remind everybody there's more conversations planned for the coming weeks, digging into some of that data and why it underscores the importance of acting in a systemic way, doing those multiple approaches to support children and families in learning. And then digging into some of the approaches, looking at summer and other ways that we can support children in learning. And then also in the earlier time slot on the 26th, we'll be having another one of our Crucible of Practice salons looking at Kansas City and some of the strategies that it's been using to support the sustainability of its campaign over nearly a decade. Thank you all for joining in. Thank you especially to our amazing panelists for joining us today. Loved hearing from all of you, and hope that you all stay safe and take care.
Thank you so much. You have a great one.